I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this knowledge conversation seminar on the future of worker-manager relations, where we ask the question, does cooperation lead to better outcomes and just rewards? As you know, worker-manager relations are a critical area of research within the world of work and future work. Understanding how workers and managers interact is key to addressing some of the most pressing issues facing the world of work today, such as job insecurity, inequality, and social dialogue. For today's session, please feel free to write any questions in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'll try to get to them after the presentation. I hope this will be a very lively discussion. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to Alim Khan, who is a knowledge management specialist at the ILO and who will moderate this session. Thanks, Aline. Over to you.
Thanks, Alessandro, and welcome to everyone to this knowledge conversation. It's organized by the ILO's research department and our knowledge management team. And I'd like to just say that this knowledge conversation series actually covers a broad range of world of work topics. We held one prior conversation on reinventing organizations, looking at moving from hierarchy to self-management. So some similarities with today's today's talk. And that one you can find on the ILO intranet if you're interested, along with the other talks in the series. And as Alessandro mentioned, today's topic is looking at the future of manager-worker cooperation and whether this leads to better outcomes and just rewards. Or will a dark side perhaps of leadership prevail, enabled by the digital transformations underway in firms as well as in societies at large, with consequences for everything from morale to productivity to growing inequality. So on this topic, we are fortunate today to have two distinguished guests. It's my pleasure to introduce them to you. Stephan Billinger and Stephen Mark Rosenbaum are both from the University of Southern Denmark. I'll provide a brief introduction to each of them in turn before turning it over to them. Let's start with Stephan Billinger. He's a professor at the University of Southern Denmark and part of the Strategic Organization Design Unit and the Danish Institute for Advanced Study. His research focuses on how businesses are structured and how decisions are made within them. He looks at how authority is given and what the effects are when people work together. And he studies this by doing experiments as well as in-depth case studies of real businesses. And Stephan's written papers that have been published in academic journals like Organization Science and the Journal of Experimental Economics. And before being at the University of Southern Denmark, he received his PhD in business administration from the University of St. Gallen here in Switzerland. And he's also worked as a researcher at the London Business School. And now turning to Stephen Mark Rosenbaum, he's an associate professor in the Marketing and Management Department at the University of Southern Denmark. His research interests are focused on international marketing, strategic partnerships, and globalization processes, with a particular focus on emerging economies. He conducts also experiments in order to study pro-social norms such as trust and cooperation and how these affect macroeconomic variables. And one of his main research topics is social norms on an international level. He also looks at how managers can encourage their employees to work together, especially when leaders prioritize their own interests over their workers. And this research has been featured in The Economist, drawing on a paper authored by both of our guest speakers today. So they bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to our discussion today, and we're fortunate to have them to share their insights with you. So with that, I'll turn it over to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alim, and thank you, Alessandro and Nikolai, for making sure that this knowledge conversation can actually take place. It's been a great pleasure. We've talked about it for a couple of years now, and now we have the opportunity to share some of ideas with you. So a very warm welcome to everybody joining us. And as Alim said, we're based at the University of Southern Denmark, and we've actually had a common research agenda for about a decade and a half now, where we're interested in economic experiments and how we can manage social dilemmas. In other words, how do we manage this tension that people have between being self-interested, what we often call homo economicus, and actually exhibiting other regarding or social preferences. And we've looked at this in many countries around the world and conducted experiments quite extensively into this. So we basically have spoken to the ILO because we feel that there are complementary areas of focus. And when we go through the ILO's agenda and most recent publications over the last few years, we can see that there is indeed a common domain where our experimental evidence and the games that we play with different people can actually be used to help policy implications, for example, and actually examine some of these issues. So when we're talking about the ILO, there's a lot of focus about this issue of social justice within the social contract, where the workers are obviously voluntarily giving up free time to be able to work and expecting a just treatment for that sacrifice. And we also know, reading the ILO publications, that wage growth is below productivity growth. There are a lot of gains that organizations are making through enhanced productivity, for example, which don't necessarily trickle down to the workers. And this obviously leads the workers with, in many cases, a profound sense of injustice or unfairness. And these are the social preferences that we tap into with our experiments and the various games that we play. So yes, we focus on economic experiments. We actually pay people to do the wrong thing. In other words, we pay people, we incentivize people financially to be self-interested and not display social preferences. And in that sense, if they choose to sacrifice that monetary payment and give up money, then that is much more a sign that they are exhibiting other regarding preferences. So for this reason, economic experiments have been used and become almost a gold standard now for causal inferences. We can see what is it that affects people's behavior. What is it that gets people to be more inclined to be honest or trustworthy or cooperate with others? And many of these settings have been in what we call social dilemmas. Many of them have been what we call decentralized. So in other words, you don't have a leader as such, you just have a group of peers that try to ensure that they can try to enhance some form of cooperation or trust between or among them in a decentralized setting. What we do is we take these social dilemmas and we actually make them organizational dilemmas. Say, well, in reality, we have organizations which are hierarchical structures, typically, where we actually have managers, and at the lower end of the hierarchy, we have the workers. And this is also been looked at quite a lot in the literature. There's a lot of corporate governance literature in terms of how boards of directors can ensure that managers don't shirk or engage in moral hazard, for example, towards the organization. And what we do is we have a slightly different focus. We look at, to what extent do managers' behavior actually affect the willingness of workers to actually cooperate in terms of joint productivity. So are workers going to feel that managers' behavior is in some way going to affect the way that they actually feel and how does that affect their social preferences? Are they feeling disillusioned? Are they feeling exploited, for example, by managerial behavior? And there's a lot of literature which talks about the so-called dark side of leadership, that managers also shirk towards their workers in the same way that they may be inclined to shirk towards their boards of directors and shareholders in a corporate governance setting. And of course, this may be deemed or perceived as being unfair by the workers. And how does this actually affect the workers? What actually happens in terms of cooperation levels, for example? Because if we see it has an adverse effect on cooperation, this clearly has negative implications both for the workers, who often lose remuneration, but also, of course, for the organization as in its entirety, if it's unable to engage the workers and ensure that managers can engender cooperative behavior from the workers. So what we do, how do we study this? Well, we study it using what's called a workhorse experiment within experimental economics, and this is called the Public Goodscape. And basically, this is a game that players play. In this case, it's played anonymously. So you can imagine a group of 4 people, and everyone is given the same endowment. It could be $10, it could be a different amount, and they're not allowed to communicate with one another. And the players very simply have to make one decision. They have to decide how much of that endowment they actually keep in a private account, which they get back at the end of the game, and how much do they contribute to the group account, or the public good, as it's sometimes called. And all contributions to the public good are doubled by the experimenter, and then they're divided equally, irrespective of how much each of the individual players has contributed. So in the equation here, we can see that the payoff for any one individual I is equal to their endowment minus the amount that they're contributing to the group account, plus, and then we have this variable here, 1 over n multiplied by g. So this is 1 divided by the number of players, in this case 4, multiplied by g, which is 2. That's the amount that it's been doubled by. And then that's multiplied by the amount that the individual I has contributed and the sum of all the other players in the game. So this is a classic experiment, and we can see this has been conducted over the years in thousands of different settings. And these are decentralized. In other words, it's peer-to-peer behavior that we're examining here. And this is one of our colleagues, Benedikt Herrmann, who has published a very interesting article where he conducted the same experiment using purchasing power parity. So everyone was playing for the same financial incentives in the countries in which they're represented, with the same number of students, where everything was controlled in terms of gender and age and study and line and such. And we can see here that out of 20, for example, euros or 20 tokens, there's quite a bit of variation in these 17 studies. There are some that are contributing 8 out of 20, so 40%, and others going all the way up to 14 out of 20. So there's a certain variation across different cultures here. But the interesting trend here is a downward trend. And this is simply quite logical, that when you experience that you are cooperating and you're putting money into the group account, and others, of course, are not doing that, they're choosing to put it in their private account, then we can see that there is a clear decline or deterioration in the contributions that people are making. So what's socially optimal is, of course, for everyone to put everything into the middle. But what is individually optimal is to put everything in your private account and free ride totally, and hope that everybody else contributes fully into the middle, so that you can enjoy the benefits of the public good without actually contributing to it. And of course, if everybody does that, then everybody ends up with the amount in their private account, which of course is suboptimal compared to the amount if everybody had contributed into the middle. So this is a classic free riding experiment. And of course, this is used in all kinds of different settings. It's used a lot in the real world, as we call it, in terms of, how do we motivate people to contribute to environmental treaties? How do we get companies to share knowledge within networks or joint ventures, and so on and so forth. And we can see here that Benedikt Herrmann used the same experiments, but allowed the peers to actually punish one another if they felt that they were free riding. And by punishment, you take some of your own earnings, some of your own endowment, and actually use it, give it up, surrender that, to punish somebody who you feel is being non-cooperative. And as you can see, when people are invested with that opportunity, then the cooperation levels rise quite significantly and remain fairly stable over time. So you can play this game once, and in this particular case that Benedict used, he played it over 10 rounds with the same group, so stable groups where the groups can learn a little bit about each other's behavior.
So what we were doing here is thinking about this baseline public goods games and thinking about how can we put an organization around it. And the first step that you would think of is, of course, that it would be good to put a manager here in place who basically manages the team. And we have a lot of literature that would suggest that that hierarchy that you would implement here would facilitate cooperation, right? By implementing a manager or leader, you would create status. You would have someone who has status, who can hold everything together and make sure that you have positive contributions and that the role of the manager benefits the whole organization. Social psychology has written about this a lot, and also in economics, there's a set of experiments that look at the leading by example variations of this, where you would then find that contribution levels are improving because of the manager. At the same time, there's also literature that clearly says that hierarchy would inhibit cooperation. Again, social psychology would has a number of studies that clearly shows that the moment you have a manager that has more than one subordinate, that over time these different subordinates will feel unfair, to be treated unfair by the manager. Now that's not always the case, but the moment people make dissimilar contributions to a common good, managers are typically inclined to have also dissimilar treatments of the workers. Some may get more, the others may get less. And that will result in a perceived unfair treatment that then again reduces cooperation levels. And in economics, we have quite a lot of literature that would argue that managers are actually self-interested, and that means their primary concern is to improve their own income and not so much the one of the workers. So literature, depending on which camp you look at, you will have different hypotheses regarding how a manager will now influence cooperation levels. And in one of the experiments that we ran, we used that as a point of departure and also thought about creating a public goods game or a variation of it that better mirrors also what we see in real world organizations. And we have a lot of organizations where managers would discuss whether the manager should be part of the team, should be a working manager, or whether the manager is removed from the actual shop floor, so to speak, and is just governing the team, is maybe coordinating with other teams, is basically a role that does not engage in the work that the workers are engaging with. And that is what we will, or we talked, what we conceptualized here as discretionary contributions. Is a manager present or absent from making contributions to the public goods? In some way, that's also mirroring what you earlier on had in some of the other conversations, where the question was, how many levels of a hierarchy do you have, right? We have a flattening of the structures. In some way, we mirror that here as well. A flat structure would be one where the manager has to contribute to work and is present, makes contributions, and the other one where the manager becomes the more conventional, traditional hierarchical role. The manager is absent from making discretionary contributions. That's one dimension, one independent variable we use, and the other one would be the discretionary returns. That is, whatever the earnings are from the public goods, the question is, how are they shared? Is it the static share that the manager gets equal to what all the others get? Or is it a dynamic share? That is, the manager has the power to adjust return rates and, again, give workers what he or she thinks is the right amount for a given worker. And you can see with these two independent variables, we can nicely come up with a 2x2 and examine basically to what extent now different organization designs and different forms of hierarchy may influence cooperation level. And we put that in the laboratory, and these were the results. So for contribution shares over those 10 rounds, we can clearly see the baseline, that is what we've seen earlier on the slides that Stephan presented, that without punishment, contributions go down, people start free riding, and the public goods shrinks. Now, the moment we implement our discretionary mechanisms, that's similar then to what we had earlier on in punishment, the contribution shares go up. Now, the interesting bit here is that in one particular treatment group, the one where the manager is absent, not contributing to the public good, and at the same time, the manager is given the dynamic, the ability to dynamically adjust returns. This is a setting where over time and towards the end of the experiment, we could not detect a difference to the baseline anymore. And that is quite, for us, that was quite a shocking result. We would have thought that the manager, to some extent, should be able to maintain contribution levels significantly above the baseline. But we found that in one hierarchical setting, that is actually not the case anymore. It becomes, at least here towards the end, indistinguishable. So we further looked into these results, and what we found, again, now comparing the treatments where the managers are absent versus the managers are present, that on the receiving side, managers were actually quite smart in the way they were going about managing that public goods, managing the team. And we can see that the manager, the green line on the left side, when he or she is absent from making contributions, then over time, the manager was reducing contributions, basically signaling to the team, I'm giving up potential earnings I could have, thereby basically luring their workers to improve contributions, which we see to some degree here, only to then basically take advantage of the higher contributions toward the end of the experiment and basically cash in. So managers, and that's what we particularly see on the right side then, when managers are present here, that managers are quite strategically going about how to manipulate behaviors of their subordinates and also constrain their own behavior to basically get people to do what they want them to do. And we found significant results here that really clearly show that hierarchy again offers managers a clear opportunity to exploit workers in settings like this. Now, the summary of this is that we clearly see that there's a lot of strategic luring taking place, nudging, if you wish, where managers carefully think about how to get the most out of that public good, not for the worker, but for themselves. And we have clear evidence that managers exploit their workers. We also have clear evidence that there are clearly cases where a bad hierarchy may be actually worse than having no hierarchy at all. And I think that's also going back to the discussion we had at some other point concerning what is the role of hierarchy and how should we design it and carefully think about discretionary contributions and returns to establish organizations in which both benefit, the manager and the workers as well. And there's quite a lot of other evidence from other researchers, of course, that look into similar phenomena that show that managers have no effect or also negative effect on the worker cooperation levels. Also a line of work that shows that leaders typically contribute less than their subordinates, or that in terms of discretionary rights over distribution, that there's large differences between managers and worker earnings. So again, self-gain becomes a dominant motivation for acting as a manager here. And you may say, well, this is just lab results. I think what is really to be learned here is that we can see from these experiments that we can use real-world motivation in terms of how work is structured, how hierarchy is designed, to go into the lab and see now which mechanisms lead to which type of behaviors and outcomes in terms of behavior on the worker side and behavior on the manager side. And I think that's really important. Our contribution here is to really highlight the necessity to carefully consider what we term discretionary contributions and discretionary returns to have effective cooperation in organizations. Now, this specific experiments motivated us also then to say, well, it would be nice to summarize all the prior work, not only singular studies, and make a meta study based on these different hierarchical public goods games. And there we found some interesting insights.
Yes, so just to finish up on Stephan's comments there, our experiments were conducted with around 400 subjects. And yes, there's actually quite a high level of correlation between lab and field behavior. So in other words, when you play these experiments in the lab and you play them in the field as well, there's a very high positive correlation between behaviors. So the lab data are actually very reliable in that sense. But what we wanted to do was take a look at what happens when we combine or collate the information from lots of different studies in this particular field, and see, are we some kind of an outlier in terms of our results, or is it a trend that we see when we look at the collated data in the meta study? So what we do here is we basically looked at the literature in terms of how leaders are selected, because there's a lot of studies that look at the comparison between what's called endogenously selected and exogenously imposed leaders. Now, what that means is, if we take the latter first, exogenously imposed simply means a classic hierarchical sense where the leaders are imposed upon workers, typically from the CEO, for example, or the board of directors that imposes leaders. Whereas when they're endogenously selected, it's the group themselves, the workers themselves, that actually select their own leaders in some way. It's not exogenous, it's endogenous to the group itself. And that can be in lots of different ways. That can be that a worker volunteers to be a leader and take responsibility for the group and to try to engender cooperation. It could also be that the leaders, for example, are voted by the other workers and become a leader that way. And what we've done here is we've compared the studies, and there are several thousand study or data points here. So in other words, when we look at the N at the top, we can see that there's just under 5,000 students or subjects, typically students, subjects which have been part of the endogenous leadership meta study here that we've conducted. And in the exogenous one, we're talking about almost 23,000. So there's significant data points here upon which to base our meta study. And what we can see here is, of course, that it's falling quite considerably under both forms of leadership, but actually that the endogenous leadership still has slightly higher levels than the exogenous leadership. And this, we've also found lots of studies that show that when you have exogenous leadership, you don't necessarily get superior outcomes than having no leadership at all. In other words, having the baseline treatment with no leaders, the decentralized public good game that we talked about before. And we also know that when you compare the same experiment, both with endogenous leadership and then a few minutes later with exogenous leadership, you find that the former creates significantly higher contributions than the latter. So irrespective of the way in which the leaders are selected. So there's a lot of evidence suggesting that even when, for example, leaders are endogenously selected, when they choose to sanction individuals, and by sanctioning mechanisms, we typically talk about punishments or rewards, they're far more effective actually when the leaders are endogenously selected than when they are exogenously selected. And then we looked at another issue here, which is about monitoring. And monitoring also is very interesting in the literature because workers feel in many cases that monitoring is an intrusion on their rights, on their own self-determination in many cases. And what we see here is that when monitoring takes place, and again, we're looking at the difference between the baseline here, where we monitor in the upper right chart, and in the lower right one, we have the monitoring itself. And we can see in all cases, even though you have monitoring, you're unable to ensure a stable contribution curve. The contribution curve will be falling in all situations. And that was exactly the same with the leadership. So in other words, having leaders doesn't necessarily mean that the leaders are able to reverse this deterioration in any way. And what we often find here is that there's a lot of studies showing that when workers are being monitored, they actually contribute far less. They actually feel that their social preferences are being violated. Their norms of fairness, or what we call inequality aversion, are being violated by the managers who are watching them. And this is very interesting in terms of workers' social preferences, because what we found in our own experiment, which Stephan described, was that even though at the very end of the experiment, the managers take disproportionate amounts of money out for themselves that the workers have contributed to the public good, we still see the workers actually engaging in good faith. In other words, the workers still want to believe in the beneficial capacity of leaders and the goodness of leaders, and they still contribute to the public good, even though the managers are systematically taking money out for their own self-gain. And this is rather interesting, of course, because this taps in a lot to what the ILO is talking about in the publications about how do workers feel about this kind of situation? What kind of feelings does it engender in workers when they are feeling that they're being unfairly treated, or that the rewards that they're getting are very unjust? So when we're talking about cooperation, and in the title we talk about, well, does that lead to a better outcome? Then we're talking about efficiency. Are we able to improve performance through leaders? And then, of course, we can see in some cases that's not the case. And then, of course, the second part of that question was, does it also lead to just rewards? And what we clearly find is that that's not the case, that managers have a propensity to actually exploit their workers. And it's not just our own studies, but in multiple studies, it's now becoming the bulk of that research over the last decade or so, looking into managerial opportunism, or this so-called dark side of leadership. And we can also see it in our meta study, that managers were actually unable, across a whole range of different mechanisms, unable to actually induce the cooperation, the enduring cooperation of their workers. And this was largely due to worker self preferences, where they felt that it violated their sense, their own norms of what is fair and what is just.
Yeah, and that brings us to our discussion points in terms of what are these hierarchical dilemmas that we can identify in terms of what is there for us to think about from the worker's perspective and also from the manager's perspective. So for us, big question is, what are the rewards, right? Rewards based on outcome or effort or both seems to be a big question that should be addressed, but also what happens if both are hard to assess. So there's a series of experiments, we haven't focused on those now here, where you obscure the extent to which you can observe what the others are doing and what the manager is doing. And obviously, the less you have transparency, the less people are inclined, and particularly in long-run games, to then also reduce their contribution levels. If there's transparency, that typically improves it. So should we go for transparency, or is there also disadvantages to transparency? Some work suggests there is disadvantages. How should, more generally, workers set their effort levels then if managers exploit, right? So if you detect that you have a managerial system, a hierarchy that does exploit, not only on the organizational level, but also on the managerial level, then the question is how to adjust the contributions you make. I would think a lot of workers are thinking along those lines. That's at least what observation then in firms suggest. I would be curious to learn more about what are the mechanisms that then workers work with, and how can, again, organizations design better structures so these type of behaviors do not occur. From a manager's perspective, from the organization's perspective, big question is how to design and implement a fair remuneration scheme, right? That strategic luring on one hand, but also then worker exploitation on the other hand, are contained in a way the organization benefits, and we find a balanced and just system, right? And having the just leader. So ideally, we can design an organization with mechanisms so the leader can only be just, ideally, right? That would be the dream. I guess it's not possible in all situations, but I think by looking more carefully at the mechanisms at hand, organizations can improve the way they go about defining the scope of action available to a manager. And then the big question is how to balance reward and self-reward if you're not the owner of the organization. And I argue the majority of managers we have in firms and organizations are not the owners, but hired from the owners or shareholders. More generally, we would then ask, what does AI do? There's already experiments using AI where some of the players are actual computers or bots. So how does that change the picture? What happens if the manager becomes an AI, a computer? Another question. And finally, I think this line of work also can inform and think more in a more structured and academic way, perhaps, about hybrid work modes and how to make sure that developments we've seen over the last years are channeled towards a direction that, again, would allow everyone to benefit, including also particularly the organizations who set up the whole structures in the first place.
Yeah, and actually, our work was published a couple of years ago in the Economist, in Bartleby in the Economist, and we've also been asked by a couple of multinational firms to also help them understand a little bit how do they try to train their leaders to be just in some way, to be fair in some way, because many organizations are realizing that this is actually a problem. And when we look at our own findings, and we can see that the treatment that has the lowest level of contributions, which is statistically insignificant from the baseline where there's no manager at all, is the AD treatment where managers are absent. In other words, they're not contributing. And of course, when it's dynamic. And what we find is that workers are very, very suspicious when managers have the dynamic ability to redistribute the awards, the rewards from the public good. So in other words, if they have sole responsibility to divide these among the group, including themselves, then they will take a disproportionate amount for themselves. And this obviously is something that the workers are extremely suspicious about. So they are trying to So there's many things that we talk to these organizations about, that there should be some kind of static reward, that the leaders should be visibly present, so that workers can see that they're not actually shirking or engaging in some form of moral hazard towards them. And yes, how do you give managers the discretionary rights to, assign inputs and outputs without actually having them disproportionately taking advantage of that at the expense of their subordinates? So these are very, very interesting questions. And when we talk about things like hybrid work modes and companies now calling workers back into the office after the pandemic, a lot of this is about, monitoring, it's about control. And our experiments also show that workers react very negatively to this loss of self-determination, and the fact that the workers don't necessarily believe that they will be acting in the organizational interest.
So this is it from us for now. We are curious to have questions and start a discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both, Stephan and Stephan. We do have, that was a very clear explanation of a walkthrough of the theoretical work, the experimental, and as well, we appreciate the examples at the end from the current real world examples in multinationals, sharing some of the questions actually that you've put forward. And speaking of which, one question that we have here is, how do you assess performance management of remote teams? Speaking to this last point about hybrid work that you've raised, how do you assess performance management of remote teams, and how leaders, managers can drive their team to success, seeing the barriers that remote work puts in place?
So again, starting with the theoretical work, what typically works is transparency as one clear variable that comes through in many lines of work, where basically contributions are simply made clear, and that basically is a variable that you would work out throughout a project life, for instance. So if you work on a project, you would open platform share what our contributions, what our expectations from individual contributors, and use that then also as a basis for remunerating teams.
Yeah, we very interestingly, in one of the multinationals that we talked to, they told us that their leaders were not so good at actually distributing the gains, for example, in the form of a bonus among their group members. What they were actually doing was basically rewarding everybody equally, irrespective of their effort level. So even though they knew that there was someone in the team that was outperforming the others in some way, they just chose to remunerate everybody equally. And that obviously had a very detrimental effect on the propensity of this one particular individual to keep on committing themselves and expending lots of effort for the group. So yeah, it's quite interesting, because we're talking about to what extent can some of these issues be outcome based, and to what extent are they behavioral based. A lot of them are very difficult to assess a particular outcome. A lot of these outcomes are over a long period of time and can't necessarily be, there's not a causal kind of mechanism between an action and a reaction in terms of increased turnover or increased performance or something like that. So that's also a complicated factor. You would have to look at the lagged effect of that. But also, a lot of it is behavioral based. How do you try to ascertain the contributions of someone when you can't actually measure an outcome as such? If it's in a process, if it's to do with some form of knowledge sharing or something, it's very difficult to actually identify, well, who's sharing the most important knowledge and who isn't. So I think it's very interesting discussion to have as we move towards more knowledge-based firms in many cases, more service-based firms where it's often very intangible and inseparable. It's very difficult to assess, who's actually responsible for what. But what we do know is that people respond, the workers will respond very negatively if they feel that their social preferences are being infringed. And I think that there's a preference for remote work because, you know, in many cases, the workers feel that now they're being respected in the sense that the leaders are entrusting them with working even though they can't physically monitor them in the office. And I think there's a preference for remote work for many people just for this very reason. And I think now being told you have to come back into the office by Amazon and some of these kind of companies where you're being strictly monitored, in a way is a loss of autonomy that the workers actually like. And I think this is a crucial issue.
Right, and continuing on that line of thought about monitoring, we have a question. You mentioned that monitoring is something workers feel is against their rights. Maybe we can take a look more deeply at that. Why do workers feel so, and what could be the genesis for such a feeling? Maybe this can be mentioned. You can explain it in detail, please, is the question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Because we think that monitoring is typically the way that we can get people to be more cooperative from a leader's perspective. And we know that monitoring also has a positive effect on many social norms. For example, honesty. We know that if people feel they're being monitored, they tend to be more honest than they would otherwise be if monitoring was absent. There's a lot of experimental evidence in that as well. But when we come to monitoring here, what it does is it taps into that stream of literature that looks at workers' sense of self-autonomy, you know, their own ability to manage their own times, to be entrusted to complete a task efficiently and effectively, and to be basically trusted with what they do. When they feel that monitoring becomes present, and especially if the monitoring can be quite invasive, then what they feel is that is an intrusion on this trust. They feel that the workers do not trust them anymore. Managers do not trust the workers. They feel that they lose their autonomy. They feel that they don't have a right to their self-determination in a social preference way. And for this reason, they begin to actually start to reduce their effort levels. They start to cooperate even less than they would have done before. So what we're seeing, and this also comes in the meta study, that the more you actually monitor, the more cooperation levels actually start falling. And we're talking 22, 23,000 subjects that this was based on. And this is rather interesting, that workers feel that this is a violation of their basic human rights in a way, that they can work and be trusted to do the job that they were employed to do. So it violates the social contract in that sense.
A big distinction that needs to be considered here as well is whether you monitor outcomes or the process. And in a lot of organizations, that's a huge debate. What should be monitored? When it comes to monitoring the process, you typically look at effort levels. Now, effort, we know, well, depending on the task and the skills and abilities of the individual, the effort going into something may vary quite significantly. So a big conceptual distinction that needs to be made here as well is monitoring of output versus process or input into the process.
Because we're typically in a situation that we term moral hazard. And in that sense, workers who are contracted to a particular job, just like any form of principal-agent relationship, we know that to mitigate moral hazard, you have to either monitor or you have to align incentives. And what we're seeing is it's often difficult to align incentives if, as Stephan says, that a lot of it is process-based, where it's difficult for the managers to actually evaluate the performance of people within a team. So therefore, monitoring is the logical step. But that's been very difficult under Corona, going back to the pandemic, going back to your previous question. And I think that's made it quite difficult for leaders, for managers, in the sense that they have suddenly lost their monitoring ability, and also the ability to align incentives is very, very difficult. And when we talk about the multinational that we visited that simply doesn't align incentives, it simply says, irrespective of your effort level, we'll pay you the same amount of money in bonus, then you lose that aligned incentive way of mitigating moral hazard. So this is very problematic for organizations.
Right, and just continuing on, I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator to ask a question as well. So if we think back, if we did a little thought experiment and you were to run some of these experiments that you showed us maybe 50 years ago, when there was maybe a much stronger social contract in place, would you expect to see the same sort of managerial behaviors in terms of, especially as you reach the later rounds, the kind of cashing in by managers on their position? Would you expect to see the level of effort by workers change, or do you think there was a larger kind of value system at work governing behavior that played a role, and maybe does to a lesser extent today, now that we're in the search for maybe this new social contract? Because that's very much part of the ILO agenda today, is rethinking the social contract in an era of perhaps your boss is an algorithm, perhaps you have these hybrid work modes, as you said, and we've kind of reached the limits, even if we were to put the old social contract in place. So do you think that's possible, even that you were to run these many years ago? Do you think you would have seen differences?
It's hypothetical. I would think there would have been differences in some societies, certainly. But yeah, it's hypothetical, so we don't know.
I think also there would be differences, because I think leaders would be very, very different 50 years ago than they are now. I think 50 years ago, there was a completely different work market or labor market. People were working for organizations for their whole lives, for example. People considered themselves part of an organizational family, for example. And I think in this, a little bit like Japan is still to the present day to a large extent. And I think that would probably mean that managers would feel much more social responsibility to their workers than they do now, where people move from one organization to another very quickly. Material benefits are crucially important to people as a motivating factor. And people are transitory. They don't have the same kind of loyalty that they used to have before. And we can see, actually, funnily enough, in Denmark just yesterday, there's huge scandals of people self-rewarding. We're talking, millions of euros in bonuses. That's in a way shocked society. And I think that there is maybe a type of greed that we see at the moment that maybe we wouldn't have seen 50 years ago.
And we can't go 50 years back, but there's a few experiments that actually are run in Western societies and compared to societies in which status and, for instance, the role of older people is important. And where participants are told, young participants are told, you're playing this game with an older person, and that had effects. So yes, I would think we actually have evidence for what you were also suggesting.
There's also a very interesting line of experiments within social anthropology, actually looking at traditional tribes, for example, in the Amazon or in parts of Africa, and playing the same kind of games that we're talking about with people that are not in the modern era, that come from communities where it's much more socially based, much more social conscience. People work together, people harvest food together, and so on and so forth. And we don't see that kind of exploitation in these societies. So if we regarded them as being back in time somewhat, then we can certainly draw parallels there, that we've lost a little bit of our social fabric, I think, in the globalized society, in a society where people chop and change jobs on a regular basis. There's less loyalty. There's less feelings among the leaders, I think, in terms of an organization that they're part of as a family in a way. And I think that also shows that the behavior will be very different now compared to in societies which are much more socially based.
Well, at the same time, we need to also acknowledge that we now have a much better understanding of what are relevant variables to design an organization and take care of some of the possibly negative trends we may have had. I think a careful design, considering these different variables, may actually be mitigating some of these effects.
And actually, to follow on from that, we've also done some experiments in Central Asia, and we deliberately compared two countries that had very, very varying degrees of market transition. So we looked at one country, specifically Kazakhstan, that was very market oriented, where the reforms were taking place on a radical and very, very fast process. And people were getting rich quite quickly. And we compared exactly the same games, exactly the same amount of money in their purchasing power parity terms in the other country with Uzbekistan, which was a much more traditional society, where people were more religious, where people took part much more socially in activities. And we could see that there was a significant difference between behavior across a range of different norms, such as honesty and fairness and trust and cooperation. And I think there is something there to say that when societies move in a very dynamic reform approach, and people are able to exploit the situation for monetary gains quite quickly without feeling any loyalty to their colleagues, then I think we also see the kind of basic human behavior coming out, and we become more self-interested rather than other regarding or exhibiting social preferences.
That's quite fascinating. And in fact, it takes us, I wish we could continue, it takes us to the end of our time. I want to thank you very much for myself for this discussion, this presentation. It's given us a lot to think about as we think about those organizations, as Stephan said, the ways that we have of designing organizations and new things like time sovereignty and concepts that are being created to address some of these issues that workers feel about the lack of trust and how they may be able to adapt to this new environment, and managers as well. Let me quickly turn it also over to Alessandro for closing words. Thank you.
Thank you, Elie.
Thank you, Alim. Thank you to both. Fantastic presentation. Just maybe to conclude, we will be sending a follow-up email and sharing the presentation for those that are interested. And just to conclude, thanks again for this fantastic session. We hope to be in contact soon for further events. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
And thank you to everyone for joining. Have a fantastic day.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.